Hello and welcome to the Cinema 4D scene for our first chapter of the Sci-Fi project. And I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of what we have in this scene, and you will have already probably watched the intro video where we've demoed the actual final product. And if I press play, you can see here we have the robotic arm coming in, opening up what will be known as our kind of analyzing screen, or like a portal, almost like a magnifying glass. Except it won't magnify anything, it'll just be a frame for our cool HUD stuff. And then we have this Petri dish, which will have the infected weird stuff. I've called it agar, but agar is just the substrate, and then that's been infected. So let's call it infected agar. Broken test tubes, just scene dressing, that kind of stuff. And if I, as you can see, the camera's already animated, and so is the arm. If I jump out of the camera, which is called Sci main shot camera, go to cameras, go to default camera, I can just whip around the scene. And you can see here, we've just got some dressing for the shot, basically. You know, this is the main camera here. This one over here is just like an editor camera. I like to have, if I go into the cameras, you can see I like to have a camera that I can just whip around the scene, testing out depth of field, that kind of stuff. So I don't have to always be in the main cam. However, I am pretty happy with that last animation. So you're welcome to change the animation, of course, and dress the scene accordingly, or build your own. Not a problem. But for this case, I've just created a bunch of stuff to fill the frame as the camera comes down, and then we end up close to this Petri dish. Now this is what we're calling the sample surface, and all that means is it's the area that we're going to be focusing on through this lens or screen, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so first things first, we need to have something for the analyzing screen to analyze, and as you've probably seen already, we have this leaking, creeping, gross stuff coming out of this Petri dish. And so what we need is we need a basic setup. We need to emit particles into this area. We need to have them leak over the sides and kind of creep over this surface. I don't think I'll have them come quite as far as this thing over here, but we'll see. Okay. So first up, let's prepare our colliding surface. So this is where the particles will kind of collide with. And we could add an emitter and start that way, but I think if you have the collider, that's probably more important to just get that prepped up. So we need to work out what our particles are going to collide with, and then create that as a contiguous surface. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to prep this, because if I go into a wireframe mode, or like line mode, you can see here, I've actually got it in isoparm. So if you want to see the true polygon count, you need to go into wireframe mode. And you can see these are pretty dense meshes. This one's not too bad. But the problem will be sometimes when you've got a collider, and we've dealt with this in some of the other projects, but basically if your surfaces sort of have separation and stuff, the particles can kind of go through gaps and things like that. Sometimes they fall through anyway, depending on how many subframe steps you have, but there's ways to correct that using the project settings. However, for the collider, I want it to be a nice, smooth collision with this surface. And to guarantee that, I can merge it all together with a volume operation using the Vdb Mesher. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this surface. In fact, because I have all this on layers and there's a lot of clutter around at the moment, we can actually hide some of this stuff. And maybe even lock it so that we can't move it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my layers here. And you can always get to that via window, Shift F4 or Layer Manager. And I'm going to lock a few layers. So I'm going to lock my cameras, because I'm actually quite happy with how they look. And I'm maybe even hide them from the viewport, because I don't need to see them right now. I'm going to hide the robotic arm for a minute and even lock it. So there we go. Oh, in fact, that has some sub layers, so you want to just go in there and hide them. You don't have to do this, of course. I find it more convenient to hide things, and it's useful for workflow. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of the ceiling stuff, test tubes. Actually, I'll leave the test tubes on because obviously we want to see that one still. The desk itself is actually the surround, so we don't need that, and the back wall as well. So there we go. So this is why layers are super important, is that you can. I'll hide the lights as well, actually. And lock. I like to lock things just so that I can't interfere with them accidentally and things like that. So there we go. There's our nicely cleaned up scene. And what we're going to do is we're going to take from the sample surface, I'm going to click on this object, and if I go into my hierarchy, you'll see it's a sample SDF surface. We don't need to use this piece of geometry. It would be useful because it's obviously already in the right position. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll duplicate, and I don't need the subdivided version. I can just, I'm holding Command or Control down on PC, and then I'm going to drag in, and you can see if I go into Polygon mode, that's going to be quite useful for us. Okay, so that's one part. Now we're going to duplicate the... we don't have to duplicate these, by the way. We could always just reference the originals, but I actually prefer to break them out to a separate area just so I can kind of work out what's going on. So I'm going to take this one. We're going to take the actual agar, and I'm taking the non-subdivided versions. You can take the subdivided versions. We might do that all as one operation in a bit, and that'll be fine. But for now, I don't think it's necessary. So you can see here, we've got these separate objects now, and we can hide our original sample surface. I won't use the layer because it will hide everything. So I'm just going to, what I did there is I held Shift and Alt and just clicked to hide the other elements. And now we've got this sample surface, we can actually start simplifying things a bit. So I'm going to go into Polygon mode, and I only need like, one polygon for this, just to kind of get it positioned and then give it some depth by extruding. So I'm going to select this one polygon, invert the selection, which is UI, as a shortcut for it. Any command I do, you can always go into things like mesh here, and there'll be those commands. So what I just did there was a selection command, so invert is there, and that's what we did. And I'm just going to backspace to kill those. Now in R20, the points are deleted automatically, but if not, you might have to run the optimize command afterwards. No worries, it's not really a problem. I've just noticed I've got, from when I was building the scene out, I've still got one of my mesh checkers on. So what that is, if you hold Shift M, it'll bring up the snap and modeling settings, and you can go to mesh checking, and what that was doing is I have it analyzing the meshes, and it just shows you when there's like boundary edges and stuff like that. Anyway, turn that off, you don't need that on. There we go. And then I'm going to reduce the size of this whole thing. So I basically, because of the lid, I know where the lid is, so it's over here. I'm going to make this much shorter. So I'm just grabbing this edge. I'm going to move it with the move tool. Just hit E if you need to get back to that. I'm going to move this in here. And I don't think it will come much up further than that, but I do want to go a bit close to the edge. I'm going to have it so that the goo never goes beyond this edge, but it's good to have a bit of coverage. And then I'm going to select the whole polygon, go back to Polygon mode, and then hit D, which is for extrude. And if you want to set this up, you hit create caps, make sure that's on. And then you can either just mouse in the viewport, use your cursor. You can see you get a negative extrusion. And it doesn't need to go down far, just enough so that it can create a volume. There we go. Now, because I did a negative extrude there, it actually reverses my polygon normals. So if I hit Control A, I can select all my polygons. And then if you bring up the commander, I have this bound, but you can do reverse normals. So you see that reverse normals, I've got it set to UR, and that just gets that all back to normal. Okay, so that was a fairly simple thing. But now we can start putting these into a volume mesher. So let's get our X-Particles menu open, and we want our OpenVDBMesher. There we go. Now, depending on the scale of how big this is, you want to be a bit careful sometimes. This is quite a large object, so depending on how high res that is, sometimes it's worth just putting the voxel size up before you throw an object in there, just to be safe. Now, I don't think that's going to be a problem. If I hide that, that's too low, too high, so you can see if I go down to something like 4 again, that should be meshing. If I soloed it or something, I may have not put that in properly. Let's have a look. What the meshing is? Oh, it's meshing the surface. That's not a problem. It's just too high then. Yeah, there we go. So I was being a bit overprotective, over careful there. That's just from past experience, where sometimes you put a huge object into a volume operation, and it can just take its time to process if it's got millions of polygons. To be fair, this is a tiny object, so no problem. Okay, so that's a fairly nice subdivision as well. I quite like the number of polys there, and it should be able to pick up the detail on our Petri dish and agar here. I'm going to subdivide this one. So if I'm in modeling mode, I select my Petri dish, and then I run the subdivide command. You can go to mesh, commands, subdivide, and I've got it by default to do the smooth subdivide. So if I undo Control-Z, Control-Y, just back and forth, you can see, smooth that out a bit. And now I'm going to drop that inside our OpenVDBMesher, and you can see immediately it's added to our mesh. Excellent. Then we drop our agar in. Now, this is something I'm probably going to lower where the agar is, because I want the particles to emit and kind of merge with our, or appear to merge with our original agar. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, I'll just turn off that for a second. I'm going to choose this top surface. So Polygon Mode. Now I'm going to use we've already got a selection active there, so I could just use the fill selection. So if I go to selection and there's a fill select here, and I can just click there and it'll take that top surface. No problem. Then you can use things like grow. So UI, and it'll grow that selection out. And I just want to drop that surface height. Probably drop it by about 0.5. Let's try that. As long as the particles kind of sit on that surface, depends how high we emit them as well. And I might come back and change this. We can always edit, like make the volume mesh editable later on and move those polygons as well. So it's not a major issue here. Okay, so there we go. Now that is a bit janky around these edges, just because the resolution's a bit low, and or the thickness is it's quite a thin wall there. So what we could do is we could either expand this out, or take the OpenVDBMesher, just give it a couple of more or sort of reduce the voxel size down, which I think is kind of getting there. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is just, it's going to be invisible. So it, even if it doesn't look particularly pretty in its topology, it's just for the collider. It's just for a colliding surface. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that resolution and that size. We can mess around with this later as well, so we can come back to that. One last thing I want to do is I actually want to reduce the polygons down. So it's always good to keep your colliders as efficient as possible. XP actually handles colliders really well, and I could actually demonstrate that. In fact, let's do a little quick demonstration by what I mean. I'm going to drop... I'm actually going to make this editable to start with. So let's minimize that. Let's create a duplicate. Current state to object. Close that. Turn it off, hide it. There we go. Drop an emitter in. We can use this later. And let's have it collide with the surface. Now we need a collider tag, of course, on our OpenVDBMesher editable one. So right click it, collider tag. And it doesn't matter what settings we set it to for this demonstration. I'm going to turn on this option here called draw bounds. And as you can see, as I press play, the particles are a bit large, fast and invisible. Let's do squares. So as you can see, as it collides with the mesh, or as the particles come into contact with the mesh, these boxes become sort of more refined. And what that's doing is it's basically taking these areas and sort of dividing them up so that the processing is a lot lighter, and it only processes heavily in the areas it needs to, and you get this kind of more accurate collision system. So that's what I mean by it handles collisions well. Let's delete those two. Go back to our OpenVDB mesh, and then let's play with the lower polygon count, even though it shouldn't be a problem. You can see this mesh adaptivity here in the mesh options drop down in the OpenVDBMesher, and what this will do, if I just start nudging it up, even with just that one, so it's quite a sensitive value, so a 0.01 value, you see it starts to adapt the mesh. And if I go too far, it'll actually degrade the structure of the mesh, and you can see we get these weird artifacts. But if we go back down to something like that 0.05 value or something like that, you can see we're way reduced in terms of polygon count, and that looks pretty good to me. And the advantage here, obviously, if I go into the mesh, you can see we have this continuous surface all the way over the edge, and that's where our liquid's going to leak out over. Excellent. So I think it is time to make this editable. So I'm actually going to store this in a null, and I'm going to call this our collider prep. Collider prep. There we go. And I'm going to drop that in there. I'm going to right click, do what we did a minute ago, go current state to object. I do this because it just means that you don't have to keep processing this OpenVDB mesh whilst you're playing back the scene. It's sort of unnecessary. But the reason I put it in that null is that I can always come back to it later on. So I'm going to drop that in my scene, just drop it in there, and then we can hide it. So that's cool. Now we've got this mesh here. We can check the polygon count. If I go to Shift V and you go to your HUD, you can always check these on, and I always have these on by default. So it's saved in my Cinema 4D. So you can see here we have this selected polygons and total polygons. If I actually go to Polygon Mode, you can see here I have 8,700 polygons. That's a bit specific, isn't it? Totally by accident. But what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to clear out a bunch of the underside polygons that I don't think I really need, because we are just dealing with a surface now. So what I can do is I can go to my rectangle selection, make sure only select visible elements is off. Let's go into my top view. And if I hit S, it'll frame my selected object. And then I know that my goo is not going to come back further than this. Hold Shift, and I'm going to add to the selection, and I'm going to get rid of these corners here. And I can, in fact, let's go to the squares there. I can expand this out, of course, just by polygon editing it in a minute. And I'm just going to hit backspace, and that clears out those polygons. And just from doing that, we're down to 3,600. And you can see, because we killed a lot of the detailing areas. And now if I select, in fact, what you can do is, if you've got a separate island of polygons, so if I did a select connected right now, select connected, you'll get just that one island down the bottom. What I was going to show you is that I'll undo that. If you actually just double click with the mouse, it does that as well. The only risk with that, and I use a tablet, is that you nudge stuff. So just be cautious of that. But I find it a very useful command. Just double tapping, and then you can get that. So backspace that as well, because we don't need that. And there we go. I think our surface collider is prepared. So 3,000 polys, already pretty efficient. Let's rename it. Sample surface collider. And of course, to be a collider in X-Particles, it's going to need a collider tag. So right click it, X-Particles, collider tag. And we'll come back and tweak this loads in a bit. Okay, so we've got our collider. Now we need our emitter, of course. So let's add an emitter. So there's many ways I can find this, but if I bring up Commander, which is Shift C by default, and I do XPE, you see I get xpEmitter. Drop that in the scene, and let's move it. So I only want it to be spawning or emitting in this area here, just so it's kind of near the edge and it's going to leak over that edge. I'm going to change it to just a circle. I'm going to keep it quite simple. I'm going to go to Y+, and then I'm going to make it a bit smaller. And then I'm going to move it down to the surface. So just keep moving it down until it starts to disappear just above the surface. So you can see here, if I move the camera around just above the surface, we might need to move that depending on how high that ends up being. Now, if I just press play now, it's just going to fire particles up in the air. Now, I think it was colliding some there. You got a bit of a moment where it collided, but probably because of the particle radius. But I obviously want it to stick to the surface, or not to be attracted as such, but gravity, of course, is a requirement here. So I'm going to add an XP gravity. I'm going to use the same method, XPG. There we go, gravity. Drop it in there. Press play, and you can see now our particles stick on the surface. Now they're jittering around all over the place because they haven't really got a direction to them, so they're just going to keep bouncing up and down on the surface. And we've got a very low subframe step count, which can cause that jittering. But that's not a problem. Next up, we need to make it a bit more voluminous, and the best way to do that, because this is actually going to be a liquid that's going to pour out of it, is to add a fluid simulator. So, and liquids are fluids, of course, and so are gases. And what we can do is we can go into our dynamic objects, add an xpFluid. And at this stage, we can, of course, think about keeping organized. So let's add a system object. In fact, we don't need to add a system object anymore. You can just go to xParticles menu and run the command system sort. Now, if you've got any xParticles objects in your scene, they will be thrown into this system. Now you'll notice the collider hasn't been dragged in. That's because it's not an xParticles object. It might have an xParticles tag on it, but it's not an xParticles object. So that's something to watch out for. You know, maybe it'll take a child of an object or a parent of an object. You just need to watch out for that. So let's throw that in there. I'm going to put it into other objects. And that's looking pretty cool. I'm just going to expand that collider whilst I was thinking about it. Let's go to edge mode and use that double click method. Double click there. Include that one as well and just move it towards the edge a bit more. There we go. It doesn't need an extra subdivision or anything. That's fine. We could even further reduce this density of this mesh by killing these loops, but I don't see the point. It's already below a certain threshold, and yeah, it's not a problem. So I'm actually going to hide the collider now. So let's hide that, and you can see we've got our Petri dish. Oh, that's actually our So as I just said, it pulls all xParticles objects out and from where they were sat, and it's taken our xpOpenVDBMesher out as well. So let's just put that back in there. And yeah, let's turn our sample surface back on. Now I'm just going to change the view to a non-wireframe one. And I might get rid of the grid on the floor. Sometimes I like to get rid of that just to, in fact, I do that quite frequently. Just to get rid of the visual clutter in the scene. And I'm also going to hide the icon on this xParticles system here. I'm also going to, well, I won't do that just yet, but if we're going to add other systems into our scene, perhaps for our FUI scene, part of the scene, we're going to want them not to interact with each other, or maybe we do and we'll work that out later. But for now, just that's perfect. And let's call this XP system, let's call it goo, because that's going to be the stuff leaking out of here. Okay, so that's a bit more organized. And as I press play, it's in a fluid mode now, but it's way too large. So let's, first of all, let's change the particle display to something a bit more visible. Go to squares, and let's just press play so we can see them. There we go, nice. And doing totally not what we want to do. Jittering all over the place and falling over the edges and all that kind of stuff. But we will do some things to mitigate that in a minute. But first, let's dial in the fluid solver settings. So let's take a look at how we're solving the fluid, and let's go into our fluid effects. And currently the accuracy is set to fast. Now I like to generally bump that up a little bit to kind of get a more accurate fluid solve, but also what that tends to mean is not just accuracy, or well, as a result of the increased accuracy, the volume of the fluid tends to be maintained. So we want this to we don't want this to just slip across the surface as a flat fluid. We want it to actually sort of bulge up and become kind of quite a dense, thick liquid, or sort of bulbous surface tension liquid. So I'm going to bump it just up one to a medium, and then to increase the accuracy of the collider, I'm going to increase the subframe steps in the project settings. So I'm just going to go here, bump the subframe steps up to 2, and we'll notch these up as we go. But like I like to start on a low one, but those are usually my 2 that I change when I'm starting with fluids. Now back in our emitter, now if I press play now, you can see it's flying off all over the place like we had it before, and that's partially because the particle size is huge. So and also the emitter itself is, how big is the emitter? Oh, the emitter's probably fine in terms of size. Let's lift the emitter up off the ground there, or off the bottom of the dish. Press play, and there you go, you can see it. Now, interestingly, what's happening is because the particles are so large in radius, if I go to display circles, and I hit this force display, what that does, by the way, it means that even along at this time in the timeline, you don't need to go back and play again. So that's quite useful to debug stuff. So if I turn that off, it obviously just leaves the squares, but if I go back to the beginning, it'll use circles. And you can see clearly our particles are way too big. And I'm going to drop them by a large amount. So let's go to the emission tab. Oh, and also we don't need the initial speed as well, because I just want them to kind of spawn and sit on the surface there and move each other out of the way. So let's do 0 speed. We're also going to bring modifiers in for that. Let's go to a 0.5. Now that's quite a drop, but you're already seeing that that's starting to get more of a detailed look, of course. And I'm going to drop us back to squares because we don't really need to see the radius anymore. Squares. Press play, there we go. Like I said, I'm going to have the emitter quite close to the surface in a minute. But also, I'm noticing that they're sliding around a lot, and we want them to kind of stick to the surface a bit. So we're going to increase the friction by going into our XP collider tag. And you can see here we have these bounce on collision options, and we're going to drop the bounce. I don't want it to have any bounce really, or at least maybe like a minimum amount. I'm going to drop it to 0 for now, and we'll see how that looks. But then I'm going to increase the friction. So let's go to like 70 with about 30 variation. And then in the actual emitter itself, because now if I press play, you'll see it is definitely slower, and there's definitely a decent amount of friction going on. However, if I go to the emitter and I go to the extended data tab, jump to physical data, you'll see we have this friction tab here. Sorry, friction parameter. And what that is saying is that we're taking each particle has its own friction value. And what that does is it multiplies that against this other friction value here. So we want to actually throw that all the way up to 100 and forget about it, because we're not going to vary the friction in the particles. We're going to do it on the surface. So right now that's going to multiply these values by 1, so that's all good. Okay, and if I press play again, it's going to move out even slower, or not move out at all, and do exactly what I was hoping for, which is start to kind of create a bit of a mound. Not very obvious, but it's definitely going to start doing that. And one of the main factors that creates that kind of globule forming is actually surface tension. So that's the next thing we're going to change in our fluid. So in the emitter extended data tab again, go to fluid data, and here we've got surface tension, and I'm just going to I'm going to throw it up to, sometimes I'll start really high and come down, but generally at the scale we're dealing with, that should be pretty good. So you can see here it's forming a nice liquid. Now remember, we moved our collider below the surface, so this is actually mounding up a bit more than it looks, but it's pretty cool. So if I drop that down actually a bit close to the surface, and yeah, there we go, start to mound up. What I would say is that the number of particles that are coming out of this are a little bit low. So what we could do, when you're doing a fluid solve or any kind of fluid simulation, it's actually quite good to have a decent amount of particles to get the shapes that you want. And what I mean by that is that if you don't have enough particles, you can get a lot of jittering in the source meshes. Sometimes it doesn't like maintain like a decent amount of volume and all that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to jump into here. I'm going to change the emission mode to regular. And what this is going to do is it's going to add a particle when it emits. So if I just, actually, do you know what? I'm going to change the display mode so it's not showing my materials and it shows like, let's do layer colors. So you can see here, if you go to options, layer color, you get this, you get whatever the layer color is. And if you want to change that, so as a sample surface, we could just make it gray. I do this sometimes just when I'm working, just to kind of help things out. In fact, if I lock that layer, it'll actually make it go gray, but I don't want to lock it. Let's leave it open. So that's quite a nice contrast to see our stuff going on. But anyway, I digress again. Go back here and change it to regular. And if I just nudge a frame on, and actually let's hide our sample surface. Let's hide the agar. There we go, just hide it. You can see we actually get a regular grid of particles. That's exactly what that's for. And what it means is no particle will emit in the same location. So that's quite handy, really. And it avoids collisions at the very beginning. You can even change it to a hexagonal, and that'll be even more dense, because obviously that's a slightly more efficient packing algorithm. But I'm going to leave it on regular for now. That's what I'm kind of used to using on this scenario. Press play, and there you go. We get that large increase of particles pretty quickly. And I'm liking that actually. You can see also it's filling up really quickly now as well. So you can see that, get that bulging at the beginning and then it goes out like that. And obviously it's going the wrong direction. In fact, it's even going to fall off our collider. If we show our collider, we're going to have it fall off the collider and break the illusion. So let's not have that. And let's start directing our fluid. I might just change the display mode actually. Currently, it's just all the default color green, but I actually quite like to color the fluids based on a parameter, like a gradient usually. And with this one, we could actually use a little trick actually I like to do, which is if you go to the display tab, where it's changed the color mode from color mode single color to gradient parameter. And then we've got this gradient color here, default one. We could load a preset in. We've got a bunch here. I might edit the default one. I'm just going to make a few less. I'll just right click and go distribute there. That'll be fine. That'll be fine. And then if I go to, instead of age, so if I press play now, all that will happen is the particles will fade over age, and that's taking ages because they have an infinite life at the moment. So I'm going to change it from age. Now I could use these ones. So I've got fluid density and fluid velocity, and if I hit it into auto, that just means it'll automatically conform. That's pretty cool. So we can see which particles are moving the fastest, the white ones, and blue the slowest. And there you go, as they slow down, you can see they kind of all equalize. But that's okay, but I actually really like this one. And there's a granular option here. And what this kind of does is you actually get like a surface. Can you see that? Like where the edges are the darker blue, and then the interior is like the white, is the light color. And we can even invert that. So we could do white on the outside, blue on the inside. And I find that's really useful for just getting a quick visual idea of the density of this fluid. So, or the thickness basically. Okay. So that's just a visual thing. You can change your gradient however you like. Sometimes it's good to have like a really multicolored one. I have this one that I've made. It's a candy one. And you can see there you get a real quick idea of how the structure is forming in the fluid. I might leave it on that one. It's a horrendously colored one and I quite like it. Quite useful for diagnosing. Okay. So, like I said, next up, we need to actually direct the particles to where we want them to go. And if you've used XP for any amount of time, you'll know that there are many ways to direct your particles. But I'm going to use one of my favorites, and that is using something called a flow field. And you might be familiar with these, but I'm going to add one anyway. And we'll just give it a quick rundown. So if I add a default flow field, and I zoom out a bit, we can see we get this box. Oh, we're actually in layer color mode. So if I just go to options, turn off the layer color mode, we see the modifier in its correct color. Or its default color, I should say. And you can see here we get this grid of arrows, and those arrows are actually velocity vectors, or directional vectors. And we can see here, if I change the size of it, it adapts to that size, and then I've got this cell size, so it's voxels basically. And if I drop that down to 20, you'll see we get a much denser number of these voxels. And if I just press play now, currently it's only set to direction. It probably won't have too much impact. Well, it is doing something. It is moving those particles off in that direction. So if I look from above, go back to the beginning, press play, you can see off they go. Now that's all well and good. And we could even do that direction and push them all up against that surface. But it's kind of pointless at the moment. It's not really doing anything. It's kind of pushing them over the edge, but it's not very directable. At current state. So what we can do is we can actually use objects and splines and stuff to create these vectors, these velocity vectors. And I'm just going to put this above the surface. We don't need it to be high, remember, because it's only operating on this zone here, basically. And because it's a voxel operation, the smaller it is, the more efficient it is. So there we go. I can even drop that down further because we're going to make this a higher res. Can you see it adapts depending on how big it is, like the cell size, it will adapt those voxel sizes. And we don't want them to be super huge. But we do want them to be a bit finer. So because we're going to actually use splines to control the direction here. So I'm going to actually drop it down to something like 5. And you can see how dense that's become, but also it means that we have a lot more detail. And the display mode with these arrows gets a little bit overbearing when it's this dense. So I'm going to change the display mode here, display. We actually might use these later on, but for now we're going to change it to line. And then they are now just vector lines. And they'll make more sense once you see a spline interacting with them. And I'm just going to reduce the height again. Like I said, the fewer of them there are, the quicker the particles will move through it and simulate. Let's just reduce that down there. Excellent. Now the interesting thing, of course, is when you attach a spline. So let's, first of all, let's put it into spline mode. So change the flow to, well, we're going to use both. We're going to use a long spline. So I'll add that one first. And what that's going to do is it's going to drag the particles along a spline. But of course, for that to happen, we need a spline. So let's create one. And I'm just going to grab the pen tool here. Or actually, I'll tell you what I could do. I could use a sketch spline. And what we could do is we could utilize some snapping here. So I'm going to go into my snapping settings. So if you open this up, and sometimes I like to, if you hit the top bar there, the griddle bar thing, it'll open it up in a separate floating window. And I'm going to enable snapping. I'm going to turn vertex off. And I'm going to put polygon snapping on. And what this should let us do is it'll actually snap the spline to a surface. So when you draw, you can see that we're snapping it to a surface. That's cool. So I want to do this from above mostly, and we can check. We can edit it if it doesn't connect up properly here or something. We can just edit it, and it won't be a problem. But I want it to kind of be snaking all over the place. So let's start from the center of the emitter-ish, and let's just have it coming over the edge here, zigzagging. It won't follow this perfectly. It'll be more like, oh, I think it just snapped to itself. So I just created an extra point. Just delete that one. Go back to our last tool, sketch tool. There we go. And with the spline still selected, by the way, it will add. There we go. You can add it another part of the spline to it. There we go. Oh, it's coming up at the end there. There must be something it's snapping to in 3D space. Don't worry, we'll come back and flatten this all out. Okay. There we are. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? There must be something there in 3D space that it's snapping to. What I can do is just drag it back down to the surface. And you can see it's off position, of course. Let's flatten those out. Drop them to the surface. There we go. Delete those. Delete that one. Okay. Now, I want to connect these up. Let's tidy this up a bit here, just so it's not quite under the surface. There we go. And let's just put that underneath our flow field here. Go back to our flow field, go to attributes, window, drag our spline into the objects field. And immediately you see we get a ton of directional vectors, I should say. Yeah, finding my words. And if I turn this from like a low value to a high value, and I press play, what's going to happen is this is actually going to try and follow the splines. But at the moment, it's only using the existing particle speed. So this is only giving them a direction. And we want it to actually drive the particle movement. So interestingly, it's flooding up to the edges, which is cool. But let's go back here. I'm also going to change the display mode to just the direction. So if you have if you have direction only on, it'll show everything, but I want the strength as well. So because we have a fall off value, it kind of fades away and it looks nice like that. It clears up the viewport nicely. And let's just double check the direction of our spline is correct. Yep. So when you look at them in the edit mode, there's a white to blue. Blue is the end, white is the start. And that's the direction. That's perfect. Let's give them a velocity. So I'm going to change the mode from direction to velocity. I don't really want it to move too fast, so let's just try 70. That might be way too high. Let's see. Let's just test it out. Wow, that is very strong. But it does look quite interesting. Is that actually leaving the... That's actually leaving the field. So we definitely need to just add one more layer of voxels on the field. There we go. Press play, and that's looking pretty cool. It's pulling them away from the edges. They're kind of being dragged away a bit too much from the edges. So I'm gonna use probably another flow field to tighten it up to actually attract the particles towards the splines, and that'll hopefully give us a nice kind of looking simulation. So I'm just going to duplicate this flow field. I'm going to change this to a 2 spline, and I'm going to change it from velocity to direction. I might go back to velocity, but because we've got velocity being driven by this one already, the direction might be what we need. So let's go back here, press play. You can see it's staying much more sort of bulbous and towards the splines, sticking to the splines way more accurately. That's kind of starting to look very cool. And we could reduce the particle count down if we wanted to get a bit more speed out of our sim. But I'm actually quite liking this density and this level here. So you can see it's kind of cool. They creep all over the surface. And they're following the spline here. You see it's curling around and things. Looks disgusting. Perfect. I'm going to add probably another couple of branches to it. So what I can do is, the beauty is now this is set up. I'm actually going to hide these. So let's change the display. Let's have them showing no vectors. And let's name these so we can come back and quickly edit them if we need to. So this one is the along spline. So I'm going to go along spline. And this one here is the 2 spline. There we go. Just make sure they're hidden. Let's go to our spline. Go back to our sketch tool. Make sure snapping's on. And in the points mode, I'm just going to start adding another couple of branches to this. Just so it kind of pulls away from the main stems a bit, just breaks it up. Maybe one up here. Let's make sure they're nice flat to the surface. Oh, got an escapee over there. That's fine. And depending on how strong that 2 value is, would also dictate how tight it's going to stick to these splines. But that is looking pretty interesting. And once this is simulated, I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. Of course, if we want to see how fast this is going, we can see the number of frames it's doing, but we probably want to run a hardware simulation or cache it so that we can see it in real time. We might do that in a second. And there we go. We can see it all forking out and kind of creeping across the surface, almost like it's got a mind of its own. Feel free to tweak the shape, have it form. You could have it even form something. That would be quite cool. Like a word or a reveal or something. But this is just a pure VFX shot in the sense that it's going to be just some weird abstract liquidy stuff that we're going to analyze. Okay, so that's looking pretty cool. I'm kind of happy with the shape, but I wouldn't mind it coming across the surface a bit further. So I'm probably going to extend out just part of the spline over there. So I'm just I've gone to the rectangle selection tool, drag that out there, and then I might add another zigzag in here. So I just held Control, just add another bend in there a bit more. Okay. I could drop, but let's try dropping the accuracy back down, get a bit more speed back. It won't form as quite a rounded shape, but it might run a bit quicker. It is holding, but I think I'll go back. I think the medium was giving us the best look. Okay, so in fact, let's cache it, and then I'll come back and we'll actually see how it looks in real time. So what I can do is I can just go to the Other Objects tab, or null I should say, hit the XP cache, and then if it's all set up already, all you have to do is just hit Build Cache, And I'm going to set it to only in the same system so it doesn't pick up anything outside here. I'm going to hit build cache, and I'll come back in a minute once it's done and we can play it back in real time. So I've actually just stopped that cache a bit early. I didn't really want it to do the whole timeline, so I just stopped it on about 179th frame. It only took it a couple of minutes, and I just wanted to check it out because I realized another thing is that I actually want this fluid to stop. So caching the whole sequence would have kind of been pointless, but you can see here we're getting this nice flowing simulation, and the speed's actually pretty good, but I do want it to slow down towards the end. So we can deal with that next. I'm also noticing that if I go down here, you'll see that some particles end up falling through the mesh. And it's mostly happening around about this area here. So what we can do to mitigate that is that if anything ends up inside that volume or below that object, it'll actually kill it. So what I'm going to do is, well, actually I'm going to empty the cache because we don't need that cache. We'll recache it in a second. So I'm going to empty the cache. So it goes back to default and no cache is active. And let's grab a modifier here. And I'm going to use it's going to be a control modifier, the kill modifier. I'm going to change it to from outside bounds to objects. And I'm going to select our sample surface collider as our killing surface or killing object. Now if I press play again, any particles that pass through the mesh will actually be killed immediately and not be calculated. This is especially important when we're meshing because we don't want an enormous mesh going on down miles away from the source. Okay, so there's that. Now let's do the actual slowing down of the simulation. And what we need for that is we're going to use a speed controller. So go to motion, speed, and I'm not actually going to use any of the incremental settings. So I'm just going to set that to 0. So it's adding no speed. It's not taking any away, but we are going to use the clamp maximum speed. So currently the forced velocity is about 75 centimeters or units per second. Go back to my speed. Now if I set this to about, let's say 150, and what we're going to do is we're going to map this value. So we could animate it down, but the much better way to do it is to use mapping. So jump into mapping, going to add a map, and then we could use age. Actually, that might be quite a good one to use. Or let's do, because I kind of want the whole thing to sort of freeze up at the same time, but not at the same time, but gradually, but all together slow down. So I'm going to actually change that from age to scene time, which is up here. And what that means is it's like you're adding keyframes, but it's a bit more controllable. So it's like dynamic keyframes almost. So I don't want it to start slowing down until it's at least got to, this point, sort of maybe 2 seconds in, and then it, come to a full stop by around about 120, 130. So because it's going to be gradual, I'll set this to 150. And what's currently happening is that's multiplying this value here at the 60th frame. It'll start multiplying by 0. So anything below 60 frames is going to be multiplied by 0, and therefore the speed will be 0. So if I press play now, it's the wrong way around. Can you see that? Instantly, everything, even though those particles are trying their hardest, they're actually getting frozen immediately. So what we want it to do is we actually want it to be the inverse of this. So I'm just going to right click, I'm going to flip vertical. I'm going to make this a bit more of a sort of a steady line there, and then I'm going to make this one a much softer, smooth in there. Press play. And what that should do is after the 60th frame, it's having no impact. It's not limiting the speed at all until it gets past that first 60th frame. Let's let that tick over. I could let it cache again, but I feel like we can see this. We can see that it's going to stop or not. I might add some more zigzags into these ones actually, just to break them up a bit. What we're going to do, just a bit of sort of in the next few minutes, is actually add in a mesh for this. So we're gonna mesh it, and then we're gonna add some deformation to that mesh. So don't worry if it's not particularly gritty and noisy at the moment, like a weird substance. We're gonna add that in once we mesh it. Okay, so I can tell that's slowing down. In fact, sometimes you can see the particles kind of moving less and less. It might not even reach the end of this run here. Yeah. So you can see per frame they're moving less and less distance, and yeah. I'm pretty happy to cache that, or maybe even just move on to the meshing. So let's pause that right there. And if you want to cache at this point, that's no problem. I'm just going to leave it on a freeze frame there, and we'll add an OpenVDBMesher. And let's go OpenVDBMesher. Remember I mentioned about the voxel size? I just like to put it up a second before, and then I'm just going to drag our emitter in. And if we see nothing, it's usually because the voxel size is too high. So let's go to 4. And now if I go to, oh, interesting, we've got some escapee particles still. Oh, I tell you what, I realized actually the kill object, this is a good mistake to realize what's going on here. So the actual kill surface I've used actually isn't a volume. So if there's no other surface underneath here, it doesn't know what is an interior volume and doesn't know to kill the objects or to kill the particles. So instead of using the surface, I think we can just keep it simple. Delete that, change it back to inside bounds, which means it'll kill any particle that's inside the bound. If I zoom out, go to the model mode, drag this down here, just kind of keep it a bit smaller. And then if I go to one of the side views, frame that by pressing S, and make sure it's below the surface, just below, like just there. And that should hopefully now kill those particles. So I did mention earlier that if that mesh is, the mesher would reveal it, and it certainly did. So let's go to a cleaner view. Let's go to like that mesh there. Just press play. And there we can see. Now, clearly this mesh is way too dense. So, sorry, way too large in its... actually, I do need to see the wireframe. So let's go to quick shading with lines. There we go. And I'm going to go back to our mesher and drop this voxel count down because it's way too big. But even when I drop the voxel count, you'll notice it's not getting any finer. It's not getting closer to our sim. If I turn this off, you can see it's miles away from where it should be. And that's because by default, the OpenVDBMesher expands the point radius by 10. And that's just so that you can start with a low voxel size. But let's drop it right down. Let's drop to like a 2. We might even go down to something like a point value, but let's see. Actually, let's try 0.5. And you can see now that is much more accurate to the actual particle sim. And the point radius being 2, I think that's probably fine. Let's go just drop down a notch more. And let's just see that. Yes, that looks disgusting enough, I think. Like I said, the detail's going to come from something we're going to add in afterwards, so I'm not too worried about keeping this kind of blobbiness. I actually want it to smooth. So to smooth an OpenVDB mesh, you jump into the Filters tab. So you click the mesh, Filters, click Use Filters, and I have a couple of favorites that I like to use here. Median is always on by default, so I would always have that on. That's kind of a quick... If I turn this on and off, you'll see that gets rid of the main big details. And then I tend to have either a Laplacian or a mean. I'll go for Laplacian in this one. And you can see it had an effect, but it's still kind of bobbly. So I'm going to actually iterate this further. So I'm going to have it operate a few more times. And that's looking pretty cool. I quite like how it's not completely smooth, but it's enough. It's going to be good detail for us to work with on our displacer. And that's what we'll do next. So let's just, I'm going to turn it off whilst simulating. Just let it get a bit further along in the sim. Like I said, could have cached this, but it's fine. We'll see it all together when it's cached in a minute. So, okay, so it's a bit further along. And I want to give it a bit more detail, but perhaps after simulating. So what we can do is we can actually drop a displacer into the OpenVDBMesher. So if I add one to my scene, drop that in there, go to Shading tab, go to a noise, and you can see when you add the default noise, obviously it looks utterly terrible, and you want to use a different noise, and obviously it's way too intense. So first of all, let's drop the intensity down to like a 1 or a 2. No, 1 is fine, I think. It's not very obvious because we're on a very smooth looking noise. Go to Shading. Let's change this noise to, let's go to Narky. This is kind of one of my favorites in terms of like a biological look. I'm also going to give it a bit of animation. So if I open this window here and right click and click animate, you'll see that we actually get like a refreshing frame. If I put like 0.5, you'll see, or it should do. Oh, actually, I need to animate the preview, but that's fine. So if I go animate, you'll see that actually is sort of evolving too fast there. So let's drop it down to like 0.1. And I can turn that animate preview off. And you can see on the surface though, we've got this nice gnarly looking grossness, which is exactly what I was hoping for. And you can see it's in 3D space, so the fluid kind of moves through it, but I like that effect. It'll be more evident when it's stopped actually. Okay, so let's also have, I think perhaps if we have the emitter reduced down, like it doesn't emit in all the frames, so it doesn't keep adding to the sim, and that'll actually speed up our sim. So let's have it stopping at, so I turn off emit in all frames. Let's go for like 90. Oh, that's 3 seconds. So that's the default. Yeah, let's leave it on that and see how that comes out. And at this point, let's cache it, see what it looks like, and hopefully, yeah, we don't have to do much more tweaking, and that'll be ready for the next section. Okay, back in a second. Okay, so that cached out. It was pretty quick. It took 8 minutes total for the whole 400 frames. Probably more than we actually even needed. However, I've realized something interesting, and I'm sort of a mistake, but it's quite interesting to look at. Now, remember I had this displacer on the OpenVDBMesher. Now, if I just turn off our particles for a second, and you might have actually seen just something weird happened, and I actually turn off my displacer, I actually scrub along, and it's actually baked, of course, because it's looking at the points. When it's caching this OpenVDBMesher, it's cached the points, and we've ended up with the actual displacer kind of merged in with the actual sim or cache there. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to recache it, but this time I'm going to have the displacer off, so that the reason I don't want to bake it into the cache is that it means I can edit this afterwards. So I'm going to turn that off again, run the cache again, and learn from my mistakes. Catch you in a second. Okay, so that's cached out, and let's have a little bit of a playback. And we can see it moving nice and fast, slowly, creeping across our scene, and it comes to a stop and freezes there. Now, because the simulation is continuing ongoing, there's actually going to be stuff still happening here, and if we continue too long, so what's happening is as the fluids, it's still iterating the fluid over the solve. So what's happening there is the surface tension is actually having an impact, but it's fighting against the speed. So even the speed is set to 0, it's still, the particles can still move a touch towards the end. So what would have been better is to only cache up to frame 150 where we had that freeze moment. But what we can do, because we've got the cache done now, is if I select these 2 tags, I go to the override option, and I'm going to set the time from auto time. First of all, actually, I'm going to say hold. What that means, it'll hold on whatever the last frame of the red cache is. And if I go to auto time, uncheck that, and set that to 150, that's going to freeze permanently beyond that point. Oh, I've turned the... hang on. Oh, actually, I don't need to do this with the emitter, so I can do auto on the emitter. Yeah, that's fine. I'll just turn the emitter off, in fact. We don't even need it. And there you go. You can see those moving along. We will need the emitter later, by the way, so don't delete it from the scene. Let's just check out the last thing we're going to do is check out our displacement. And let's see that. So as we play, you can see we've got this nice looking jittering and weird kind of noise over the cache. So I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. We are going to come back and do a couple of more things to this and probably recache it later on, but that's more for the FUI stuff. This is definitely going to be our fluid sim as is, and it's what we're going to see. Let's go back to our camera. Let's turn some of the items back on in our scene. Oh, let's put the displacement back on actually. Just turn that off. There we go. Turn some of these layers back on. Just brush up and down. There we go. Go to my camera, change it to the main shot camera. Go back to the very beginning. Press play. We can see now we have something for our HUD analyzer to analyze. Okay. We'll save that, and I'll see you in the next one.